Ladies and gentlemen, the President of Texas A&M University, General Mark Welch.
Thank you. And howdy. It is really good to see you. Thank you for being here today. I think this is going to be a lot of fun, and I think we're going to learn something. Let me start by welcoming all of you who are visiting to Aggie Land. It's just phenomenal to have you here. And also welcome you to the Bush Center, which is composed of the Presidential Library and Museum, the Annenberg Presidential Conference Center, where we're sitting today, and of course the Bush School of Government and Public Service, led by my great friend, mentor, and protagonist, Dr. Frank Ashley. Frank has been training me for a long time. I would also like to thank you on behalf of Aggies everywhere for being here to celebrate this week. One of the really cool things that happened to me very early in my time as Dean of the Bush School was that my wife and I had the opportunity to visit with President and Mrs. Bush several times in Houston and here when they came for events. But the first dinner we went to in Houston, we came out of, and somebody stopped us at the door and asked me about the Bushes as we were leaving after dinner. They'd already departed. And they said, yeah, it must be something to be from a family whose, family business is politics. And without thinking much, my wife Betty just said their family business isn't politics, it's public service. And I think that this family, generation after generation, continues to prove that that's true. So the theme of this week being service, and public service specifically, is just absolutely perfect. My congratulations to Andy Card and the George and Barbara Bush Foundation for setting that direction for us this week. And there is nobody better to kick off this celebration than the three people I'm about to very briefly introduce, because they are all about public service. Governor Jeb Bush and his wife Columba are still serving the people of Florida, the educators of Florida, the citizens of Florida, and anybody else who needs help with difficult problems. I think all of you know that Secretary Andy Card and the beautiful Reverend Kathleen have been serving multiple communities for decades, both faith communities, government communities. The iconic photo of Andy whispering in President George W. Bush's ear the morning of 9/11 is one that all of us who were around then can remember. And even our students these days have seen and comment on when they meet Secretary Card. And then, of course, Secretary Bob Gates has also served in so many different ways, as has his wife Becky. They are just incredible role models, and the best part about them being here today is that they are honoring George H.W. and Barbara Bush, who were, in my view, the best role models of all. Ladies and gentlemen, would you welcome our panelists?
Welcome, everybody, on behalf of the Bush family and the George and Barbara Bush Foundation. By the way, it's not just 41 at 100. It's also 41 at 99. My mom celebrated her 99th birthday last week, so. Someone came up to me yesterday and said, one of the many people that are here that got to work with my mom and dad, and said, your mom told me that you were her favorite. And I knew that all along. It was nice to get it validated. So we're here with two great public servants that went on to become deans of the Bush School, secretaries of cabinet positions, incredible people that have served on boards of directors, but today, they are deputy chiefs of staff, deputy national security advisor and deputy chief of staff. Probably the unsung heroes of White Houses are the people that get delegated all the work. Right, John? And so they're here to kind of remind everybody what it was like to serve in an incredibly consequential time for one term where you guys made an incredible difference in the future of our country. So I'm going to start with Andy because the foreign policy part of this overshadows the domestic policy in many ways because, man, I mean, you think about all the things that took place in those 4 years. It was extraordinary, but there was a lot of work done in domestic policy as well. And we're going to get to the fun stuff later. We're going to get serious first. Andy, I want you to talk about how it was that in a time where Congress was controlled by Democrats, that the ADA passed, environmental policy was enhanced, there was significant work done. Certainly the budget and tax deal was consequential. You know, I would say, just as a partisan of my dad's, he got credit for the tax increase, didn't get credit for the spending reductions that created the budget surplus that took place 5 or 6 years later. But anyway, that's just me. So what was it like serving, and how was it that this stuff happened in a period that was still partisan? I mean, politics is always dominates life in Washington. How did you guys do it, and what was the culture of the White House that allowed for this to take place?
Well, first of all, your dad was an empathetic leader. Think about it. In terms of presidents, he was the most empathetic of any president because he was on the receiving end of presidential orders from the day he graduated from high school. In almost every job he had until he became president, he was on the receiving end of a presidential decision. And he became president not to bring change to government, but to continue to build on the legacy of Ronald Reagan. So it was a very different nature of activities. The one thing that I remember happening, actually it was late in the campaign when he was running to be president, where he sought out information from the states, the governors. One thing he had not done, served in state government. He'd been on the receiving end of orders with bigger responsibilities. But it was Governor John Sununu that suggested he should meet with a group of governors. And believe me, I was there. It was a wonderful education for a president that focused more on foreign policy or economic policy than the policy that includes what happens in the states. Even the debate over Medicare and Medicaid and really infrastructure, what are the real needs, how do you stimulate your economy? So I would say the president, as he was getting ready to be president, did a lot of homework on things that he might not have been seen as much of an expert in. He had a hard time sometimes distinguishing between Medicare and Medicaid. Governors have no problem distinguishing. So,
that's for sure.
So I would say empathetically, he was always concerned about the people who would have to respond to his presidential orders. He had been on the receiving end and had to respond to them. He knew that people were on the receiving end of his presidential orders, and therefore he said, how will this be implemented? How do we know that the people who will implement this understand how important it is, and what will be happening on the other side? So empathy, I would put down as a word that defined George H.W. Bush in his domestic leading effort for the country. He had tremendous successes on the non-defense, non-State Department side. Obviously, he helped open trade opportunities in Japan and China, and believe me, there were trade wars going on and trade wars being invited. And President Bush avoided the wars and actually created a climate where our exports grew dramatically during his tenure as president, and they sent a signal to the world there. We also know that in terms of education, he said the federal government should have some way to measure whether or not academic programs are working. And so he actually created in the Department of Education an effort to say, we want to monitor and test to see if you're accomplishing what you're supposed to accomplish in taking children from ignorance to excellence. And that was something that he did basically in cooperation with a lot of the governors who said, we need help there, and he gave the help. So he wasn't just the remarkable president that we know that did a great job helping Bob Gates figure out what he should be doing. He was actually very cognizant of trying to understand better the challenges that we're taking on in the states, and he worked closely with the governors to get that done. And I candidly give credit to John Sununu to help to make that happen. And he had been NGA chairman, the National Governors Association and Republican Governors Association, but his intellect and his experience as a governor was given to President Bush very early in the administration, and it made a big difference.
So, Andy, go ahead. Andy, and we'll talk about my dad's personal touch as it relates to foreign policy, which was legendary, but he also had to deal with foreign powers in the United States Congress. And to talk a little bit about his personal relationships across the aisle that generally made it possible to get to yes, I think. More.
As an empathetic president, he could use his empathy over what it means to be a member of Congress in dealing with Congress. He'd been a congressman from Texas. So he made great friends in Congress, and the friends weren't identified by party. They were identified by, I'm going to say, what kind of person are you? And he had great friends on both sides of the aisle. He had the courage to walk into the other caucus and say, I can help teach you, maybe you can help teach me. He used to love to go to the White House, up to the House gym. And in the House gym, he would really get there and open his locker and really exercise. Who was sharing the locker right next to him? Barney Frank.
Bless his heart.
Oh, wow. But he had friends in Congress, Danny Rostenkowski, a close friend, somebody he could trust, and then he had to have very tough negotiations with him. But because he had served in Congress, and by the way, he was the only rookie congressman to come in and get a prestigious seat on the Appropriations Committee, which was a very big deal. So he had a great, I'm going to say, ability to make friends before you gave them a chance to be an enemy. I'll tell you one story. This is after a very tough vote it was on a Medicare issue. And I remember the president had invited a number of senators to come down to the White House to watch a movie. And Nick Callio and Fred McClure had been working all day long up on Capitol Hill, and we were getting the heck kicked out of us on the floor of the Senate. And I watched as the president greeted senators as they were coming in to watch a movie in the East Wing of the White House. And he's standing greeting everybody, so glad to see you. He's hugging them, he's patting them on the back, and then he sees the senator and he says, oh, I'm so glad to see you, and thanks for everything you're doing for me. And I pulled the president aside and I said, Mr. President, he was slamming you on the floor of the Senate, something vicious. He was not friendly, he was unhelpful. And he said, you don't know how many votes we got because he was against it.
That's a very good lesson. So Bob, you were deputy. Brent Scowcroft was your boss. You had a legendary team that back then, the national security team had to manage all of the rest of the foreign policy apparatus, and it was led by incredibly talented, strong-willed people. First and foremost, how did you do that? Because that doesn't always work. There's a lot of rivalries that get started and never end, but it seems to me that it seemed to work really well. What was the reason for that?
Well, let me start with the relationship between the domestic and foreign policy sides of the 41 administration White House. There usually is a lot of tension between the domestic and foreign policy side. And I worked for 8 presidents, and I saw it in 7 of them, where there was a lot of tension. Early on in the administration, Brent and I were talking, and we decided that it would make sense to try and bring these 2 sides of the Bush White House together. And so my proposal was, for the first time, and as far as I know the last time, only time in history, we invited the Deputy White House Chief of Staff, Andy, to become a regular member of the Deputies Committee that teed up all the options for the principals and the president. So Andy was able to bring to the table the domestic political perspective that none of the foreign policy gurus around the table in the Situation Room understood. And at the same time, he understood what was going on the national security side. So Brent and John had a great relationship, and Andy and I had a great relationship. And so there was never any of that tension that I had seen or that I saw in so many other administrations. And it helped the White House move as one, and without a lot of the internal divisions that you see all the time. It was a powerful team. Jim Baker, Dick Cheney, Brent, Larry Eagleburger, who was the deputy at State, and I think a lot of people forget these guys all knew each other in the Ford administration and worked together in the Ford administration. And actually, I was in the Ford administration, but at a far more junior level. I got to watch those elephants from a distance. But so there was a level of friendship. And you had the regular disagreements between state and defense. But then Dick Cheney and Jim Baker would go off to Wyoming fly fishing together. And so there was just this personal sense of trust and that you could count on each other. And there were some pretty strong debates within the administration over many issues in foreign policy. But they never got outside the White House. And I've always, of all the administrations, I've never seen one more leak-proof than the Bush 41 White House. And I'm convinced it was because, first of all of those people loved and revered 41, and they knew he would hate it.
Yes, he
They
would.
knew he didn't want that to happen. And people felt they would be personally disappointing him if they did. And so I don't think we ever had a consequential leak in 4 years out of the Bush White House. And it's because everybody trusted each other, and everybody also knew that that's what 41 wanted.
Awesome. So we've got to talk about the Scowcroft Award, which is a classic, at least in our family. It comes, to this day, it still comes up. Andy, do you want to start about how the Scowcroft Award was conceived, and then maybe, Bob, you can pile on
I'll
with...
flesh it out.
Yeah, okay.
Brent Scowcroft was very comfortable in his presence. And there were many times, when serious meetings would take place in the Oval Office, and we'd be sitting around in the couches, and the president would be sitting in the chair in front of the fireplace, the vice president or the secretary of state or whatever would be sitting in the other chair beside the fireplace, and there'd be a pretty serious dialogue going on, and then you'd see Brent's eyes shut, and no one seemed to care. The conversation would continue to go on, and then Brent's eyes would cause the body to go down a little bit. And then all of a sudden you heard, and the president said, "Let's leave the room." Everybody tiptoed out of the room. And then we'd wait to see how long would it take Brent to wake up to realize he was all alone. That became the Scowcroft Award. If you started to shut your eyes in the cabinet meeting, you could be called out and win that award. But Brent was the all-time champ.
So, Bob, defend. I mean, the guy worked 24 hours a day, so let's...
Oh, I'm not going to defend
Oh, come on.
This is too good. So, this sounds very superficial and sort of, but 41 took this award very seriously. And he evaluated people on 3 criteria. The first was, how long did you sleep? The second, how deeply were you sleeping? snoring and whistling always got extra points. But the third, and sort of the big kahuna, was the quality of your recovery. Did you wake up with a jolt and knock the coffee over? Or did you just sort of quietly return to consciousness? And he celebrated this in a very formal way. So every year there would be a big dinner in the Yellow Oval Room upstairs for the cabinet and the senior staff. And he presented the annual Scowcroft Award there. And of course, Brent won it the first year. But the winner the second year was Dick Cheney. Cheney had just gotten back from an overseas trip. We were meeting in the cabinet room, and on a very sensitive matter. And Dick was splayed out in his cabinet chair. And Bush looked over at him, and he presses the little button, and the staff comes in, and he gets the photographer and takes this picture of Cheney splayed out, and of course, the second annual cabinet dinner in the Yellow Oval, he presents this. But he also evaluated foreign leaders on this as well. And so no one was exempt. And it,
The Japanese guy must have
but
won
there's
it a
a
couple
there's a serious backside to this. The deal with Brent was that, and a lot of people didn't know this because he never talked about it, Brent's wife, Jackie, was an invalid for many years. So Brent would work until 8 or 9 o'clock in the White House, and they'd go home. People would spot him at the giant grocery store doing shopping about midnight. He'd do the laundry and do all kinds of things. He had a caretaker for her during the day. And so the reason Brent often fell asleep was because he was up until the early hours of the morning taking care of Jackie and their house. And so Bush and I, the president and I, would conspire when later on Jackie would go into the hospital periodically. And I would sneak down and I would tell Patty Prestock that Jackie was in the hospital, and the president and I had this deal. I would let him know when Jackie was in the hospital. He would then, Brent wouldn't go home as long as the president was in the office. President would call Brent, tell Brent he was going back to the residence, he was tired and yada, yada, yada. And as soon as the president left the Oval Office, Brent was out of there like a shot to the hospital. Then I'd call Patty and I'd say, he's gone. And President would come back from the residence to his office. So there was, I mean, Jeb, you can testify to this better than any of us, but I always had the feeling the president and Bond, there was a love between Brent and the president. It wasn't just mutual respect, there was a love there. And Brent was as close to being a member of the family as I think anybody could have been.
Yeah, I mean, they loved each other so much they wrote a 1,200-page book that no one read.
Yeah, they didn't know when to
It puts
quit.
you to sleep, though.
It didn't get a Pulitzer, but it got a Scowcroft.
So just, I mean, like the list of things that happened in the foreign policy realm into the Cold War, my friend Manuel Noriega going down, big things and small, the Gaddafi, I mean, there were just, like month after month, there was another crisis that was being managed all along the way, a strategy to transform the world as well. It was an incredible time, and all without a shot being fired. The reunification of Germany, just one thing after another, managing people whose traditions would have been to make the wrong choices. You guys did an incredible job, and I'm assuming that part of it had to do with the leadership of the president, but I think just as a patriot here, we've got to give a round of applause to the people that made this possible, because it could have come out a completely different way. So thank you, Bob. Were there times where you didn't think it was going to work as well as it did?
It was an extraordinary team that the president gathered around him. But make no mistake about it, he was the strategist. The rest of everybody else were the implementers. So one of my favorite stories has to do with the reunification of Germany. So everybody was against it. Margaret Thatcher was against it. Mitterrand was against it. Gorbachev clearly was against it. And so Brent would go on foreign travel with the president, and I'd go on domestic travel. So it was kind of fun for me because he wanted to talk to somebody about foreign policy while he was out there politicking, and so I got to be on the inside with a lot of things. So he is on a domestic political trip in the fall, I think, of '90, and is in Helena, Montana, and he's giving a press conference afterward, and I'm standing at the back of the room with a cell phone the size of a brick, by the way. And a reporter asks the president, well, what do you think about German reunification? And the president said, well, it's been 40 years. I think that the Germans have shown that they are dedicated to democracy and participating in the Western Alliance and advocates for freedom and so on. And if the Germans want to reunify, I'm all for it. So I call Brent. I say, Brent, do we have a policy on German reunification? He said, no, everybody's against it. The bureaucracy's all tied up in knots. And I said, well, you've got a policy now. And there was this long pause, and he said, what is it? I said, the president is all in for it. And there was this other pause, and Brent finally goes, oh, crap. Actually, it was stronger than that. But and he took a lot, just one other anecdote, he took a lot of criticism for not celebrating more when the wall fell. Yeah. And I remember very vividly, John and Andy will remember this, George Mitchell really coming after him for not dancing on the wall, in effect, for not showing more emotion. But Bush understood what none of those people understood. He understood the tightrope that Gorbachev was on in Moscow. And our worry, the president's worry, was that if he reacted too strongly, if he went to Berlin to celebrate, it very likely would provoke a coup in Moscow, a coup which took place a year later. And there was no precedent in history for the party, the army, and the KGB to all be behind a coup and to have it fail. Most of us believe that had that coup taken place in November 1989, it would have worked. And then we'd have ended up with a hardline Soviet government, and history might have changed, might have come out very differently. So people, kind of lose a little perspective. There is no precedent in history for the collapse of a great empire without a major war until that moment. And he was the one that engineered the strategy. And I go back to Andy's first answer. And it's in no small part because of his empathy. He didn't sympathize with Gorbachev, but he was able to put himself in Gorbachev's shoes and understand how perilous his position was at that time. And that's pretty damned extraordinary.
So I think my dad's life was driven by personal relationships, caring for others, serving others, and that played out pretty amazingly as it relates to foreign policy and domestic policy. But I imagine that while the reunification was taking place and the strategy was established and it was incredibly pressure-packed, he was calling world leaders, even if they weren't impacted directly by this. He was probably calling the Prime Minister of Japan to say, hey, I got your back still, don't worry about it. Talk a little bit about just the ability to stay connected even when people weren't expecting it, or just constantly being purposeful about the personal relationships that make it easier to get things done.
So this goes back to Andy's answer about the Congress. And actually at the beginning, this was actually quite hilarious, because he would start placing phone calls to these leaders who had never gotten a phone call from the President of the United States before. And I remember early on, he tried to call Deng Xiaoping. And it was like somebody calling one of us and saying, it's Queen Elizabeth on the line. Yeah, right. Well, that was the Chinese reaction. Yeah, right, whatever. And finally we had to work it through the embassy and so on and figure it out. But it got to the point he made these calls so frequently that people finally got accustomed to taking him. But what was amazing about it was that we would be in our morning staff meeting, John and Brent and me, and the president would say, I think I ought to call Moderator today, or I think I ought to call so-and-so today. And he often would call with no agenda whatsoever, or he'd maybe read that the person's kid had won an athletic award or an academic award or graduated from college or had a birthday or something. He'd find some excuse to call him up, congratulate him, tell him how great he is, and so on and so forth. He cultivated these relationships, and he built these relationships when he had no ask, so that when he did have an ask, there was a relationship. And if it weren't contrary to their own national interest, they wanted to please George H.W. Bush because he had cultivated them, had worked with them. I'll tell you one quick story involving Margaret Thatcher. So again, one of Bush's visionary things, Gorbachev was cutting troops in Eastern Europe, and the State Department and the Defense Department didn't want to do it on the US side. This was a place where Baker and Cheney were on the same side and basically didn't want to do anything drastic that would upset our allies. And the president decided, I've got to respond to Gorbachev's cuts. We can't just sit on our hands. So I want to make some force reductions in Europe of our own people. And Brent was on board with that. And so he got Cheney to put together some options and so on. And then he sent Larry Eagleburger and me to see Margaret Thatcher, Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl, and Andreotti in Italy to get them on board to make sure they were supportive. We went to see Thatcher first because we figured if we could get past her, then the rest would be a piece of cake. And so we met in her parlor, and we gave her the letter and so on. She did not like it. She was very familiar with all the details, and she finally said, I will do this because it is President Bush asking, but I don't like it. And then we went on. He did a second round of these, and Larry and I go back, and Thatcher greets us with a smile, and she says, won't you take your accustomed places? and we brief her and so on and so forth, and she really doesn't like this. And she finally agrees, and as we're walking out, she has a big smile on her face. She's got a hand on each of our backs, being very cozy and friendly with us. And she says, you two are welcome back in my house anytime. And then her face froze, the hands dropped, and she said, but never again on this subject. The next day, she calls Bush, and she says, well, I met with Tweedledum and Tweedledee. I always claim to be Tweedledee.
Andy, you got anything to add?
Tweedle 3. President Bush, number one, he had great parents. And witnessing how he lived his life frequently would cause him to say, if you came in kind of full of yourself, he would look at you and say, a lot of people are helping you. And I remember him telling me that he would come home to see his mother, and he was all full of himself because he, quote, won the baseball game. He hit the home run to win the baseball game. And his mother said to him, no, the team won the game. He understood the value of a team. And he did not allow his ego to deny success for people on the team. And he invited everybody that was on the team to recognize they were part of a team. So more than any other president I worked with, I witnessed how he could motivate people to share the credit rather than take it. And it was really evident on the domestic side of the obligations at the White House. So I'm looking in the audience, I see Bill Barr, who was Attorney General. He worked at the CIA with the President. The President had tremendous confidence in him. And Bill Barr went and did the investigation on Pan Am 103 when it went down. He did it without shining a spotlight on the work he was doing. He let the results be the results. And I don't think anybody today would say, Bill Barr did that. Bill Barr did do it, and the president gave him credit. The president didn't have to say he did it. So Carla Hills helped open trade opportunities for us. She had to work with the Commerce Department. They worked better together than in the history of the country in terms of getting NAFTA and Canadian Free Trade Agreement and opening markets in China and Japan. And it was a team that did it. And one of the criticisms we had on the political side is the president wasn't taking as much credit as he should have. He was giving credit to the team. And yes, that became a challenge as he runs for re-election. But he had the most remarkable one-term presidency on the domestic front, on the economic and trade front, obviously on international foreign policy. There was a war that took place. There was a beginning and an end and a victory celebration. And the victory celebration helped heal the wounds of Vietnam. And we forget that. But you didn't see the president leading the parade. Teams were in the parade. And that was how he served us. And boy, do we need that now.
So speaking of teams, let me talk a little bit about the president and the military. So one of the most fun experiences that I had with the president actually involved incredibly serious matters. The president, after Saddam invaded Kuwait, the United States had about 225,000 troops in Saudi Arabia. And the president was determined to liberate Kuwait. The Pentagon was much less enthusiastic about that objective. They had clearly put in place provisions to make sure that Saddam couldn't go any farther, but they really did not want to tackle Saddam's forces in an offensive manner. Well, the president was insisting. And generally when the military doesn't want to do something, and the president does, the military puts forward an option that is so huge that the president is deterred. President Reagan at one point when he wanted to attack Libya in the mid-1980s and actually invade Libya, the Department of Defense put together a proposal that looked a lot like D-Day. So the president insisted on the offensive option. So Colin Powell arranged, and General Schwarzkopf's deputy came in to brief the president. And it was Baker and Cheney and John and I and Vice President Quayle and a handful of others in the room. And this guy briefs what the military wants to do. So first they want to bring, and Mark, you may have to correct me here, he wants to bring the 7th Corps from Germany to, these are the 2 heaviest divisions in the American Army. They've been painted green, and in Germany since 1945. Pentagon's going to paint them all tan and bring them to the Middle East. So the 2 heaviest divisions in the American Army. Second, it's going to take 6 carrier battle groups, strike groups.
Holy.
And finally, you're going to have, and this is 2 weeks before the midterm elections, I should say. And he said you're going to have to activate the National Guard and reserves 2 weeks before an election. And to the day I die, I will never forget. The president stood up, looked at Dick Cheney, and said, "You've got it. Let me know if you need more," and walked out of the room. And Cheney turned to Brent and said, "Does he know what he just ordered?" And Brent smiled and said, "He knows exactly what he just ordered." The Bush White House was full of laughter. It was he had a wonderful sense of humor. People had a lot of fun. Well, some people probably had more fun than others, but that's another story. But
They slept through it.
But the president had this great sense of humor, and he was always joking around and everything. When it became clear that we were going to go to war against Iraq, that all disappeared. He almost from day one seemed visibly to take on the burden of what he was going to order these young men, principally young men, to do in going into battle. And the ranges of the estimates of casualties were huge, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, maybe 40,000. And people often accused Colin Powell of trying to scare Bush out of doing this invasion. I don't think that at all. Colin was a veteran of Vietnam. He'd been to Vietnam. He wanted to test the president's mettle to see, once we start this, will you be with us through the end? Will you see it through, no matter the cost, once we start? And the president gave him the right answer. But Bush was very somber through that whole period, and not until it was over. This is the only administration, I think, in history where before the first shot was fired, the president ordered that we put down in writing what our aims in the war were. And once we accomplished those aims, we would stop. So the Deputies Committee came up with, you got to get Saddam out of Kuwait, you got to destroy the Republican Guard divisions as an offensive weapon. And then the question was, do you make changing a regime in Baghdad one of the war aims? And we debated the first two for about a minute, and the third one for 2 weeks. And we finally recommended to the president, no, because you don't know if we can accomplish that. And so we did this. The war went as everyone remembers. Colin was ready to recommend to the president that we stop. We picked a time. John Sununu looked at his watch and he said, if you add 4 hours to that deadline, it'll be the 100-hour war. And that's what it was. And Jim Baker and I used to joke about this. We took a lot of criticism for the next 10 years about why we didn't go to Baghdad. After 2003, we never heard that again. I'll tell one final story about the military because it reflects how deeply he felt about people in uniform. Early in the administration, there was a terrible explosion on the battleship Iowa. It killed 47 sailors. The president was going down to Norfolk to deliver remarks at a memorial service. And we were on the helicopter, and he kept reading through his remarks, and he kept crying, starting to cry. And every time he came to this passage, he'd start to cry. And because everybody who knows him knows how sentimental he was. And finally he put his speech down, and he looked at me and he said, I once asked Ronald Reagan how he got through passages like this in his speeches. And he said, Reagan told me just read it over and over and over and over again. And he said, that's not working for me. And we got there, and he raced through his remarks. Press criticized how he raced through his remarks. But I knew the only reason he raced through his remarks was because that was the only way he could get through the remarks, because he felt it was so deeply.
So we've got 9 minutes and 40 seconds, and I think we need to end with a little more levity, just for the record here. So Andy, you mentioned to me that, and it's pretty clear in his post-presidential life, my dad loved to invite people to do things. In fact, I forgot that he invited Taylor Swift to Kennebunkport, and she came. Little did we know that, anyway, so give us a couple examples. Give us a couple of examples. You mentioned Roger Clements and Mother Teresa. Both those stories are kind of interesting.
Roger Clements and Mother Teresa, what an interesting couple.
That's why I brought them up.
I'll do the Mother Teresa first because it's a big deal to have a living saint show up. Mother Teresa made a trip to Washington, D.C., and she scheduled a meeting with members of Congress, House, and the Senate, and she was pleading for a meeting with the President of the United States. And the request came in. The President was eager to say yes, but we had to find out why was she coming. And she'd been on Capitol Hill asking for a very significant donation to her cause. And Dick Darman, who was the OMB director, does not like anyone who has high expectations on any cause. And so Dick Darman wrote a memo to the president saying, I understand that you will be seeing Mother Teresa. You should know that she has been asking for, and it's quite a bit of money, and this is what your response should be. We'll take it under consideration. Lots of other priorities and whatever. And the president received this memo and read it, and he was really excited about seeing Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa arrives with a very small delegation, and they're escorted into the Oval Office, and the president stood up and welcomed her. She's a very petite woman, and she greets the president, a very firm handshake, which kind of surprised people. And then the president welcomes her and says, please sit down in front of the fireplace. And the president took his seat in front of the fireplace, just opposite the resolute desk, the president's desk. And the president welcomes Mother Teresa and her entourage and says, I understand you're here. I look forward to hearing from you. And she says, let us pray. And the president folds his hands and shuts his eyes, and Mother Teresa starts to pray. And it was a very nice prayer. And then I see the president's eyes kind of open up as she's still continuing with the prayer. And then she makes a very strong ask in her prayer. And the president appropriately takes out the memo from Dick Darman and reads literally from it. We understand your interest. We look forward to having that involved with other issues, but the answer is no. And Mother Teresa says, let us pray. And Mother Teresa prays and prays and prays and says, do you have any new information? And the president says the same thing back to her. And we'll take a look at, we'll be actively taking a look at it, but I can't give you a commitment. And she said, let us pray. And she does a very long prayer. The president opens his eyes, she looks right into his eyes, and he says, we agree. Roger Clemens. I'm a Boston Red Sox fan. Clemens pitched for the Red Sox, pitched for the Yankees, big hero in Texas. The president loves baseball. And if you were a professional baseball player and you came to the White House, you were almost always guaranteed an invite into the Oval Office. I received a call as Deputy Chief of Staff and a Red Sox fan from the Red Sox organization because the Red Sox were going to be playing the Baltimore Orioles. They had a free evening, and I was asked if I could give a tour to some of the players from the Red Sox team to come to the White House. If you invite someone to come to the White House, you have a bit of knowledge that other people don't have. You know who they are. You also know their social security number and everything else about them. And so I knew the players that were coming. There were about 8 players that were on the list that came in to have a tour of the West Wing and the White House. And Roger Clemens' name was among the group that was coming in. And I would not take anyone into the Oval Office without the president's permission. So I called over to the president. I said, I've got some baseball players from the Red Sox who are in town to play the Baltimore Orioles. When I give them a tour of the West Wing, can I take them into the Oval Office? And he says, oh, sure, go right ahead. That'd be fine, no problem on my end. And he said, who's coming? And I went down the list, and I got to Roger. He said, Roger Clemens is coming to the White House? He said, invite the players. Yes, they can come in and see the Oval Office, but then I want you to send the other players away. They can thank you, but have Roger Clemens stay and come back into the Oval Office after a few minutes. So I said, okay, I'll do that. So we give the tour to the Red Sox players and go to the Chief of Staff's office, the National Security Advisor, the Roosevelt room, the Cabinet room, walk down the colonnade, out to the Rose Garden, come back in, walk into the Oval Office, describe the Oval Office, the rug with the seal of the President, under the seal of the President, the ceiling in front of the seal of the President, and the Resolute desk. It's all very moving. And then I escort the players out, thank them very much, but I asked Roger Clemens, why don't you stay back here for a few minutes, and I think there may be a guest that'll be coming in over to see you. So he waits in the outer office while I take the team and discharge them. And then I come back into the Oval Office and bring Roger Clemens into the Oval Office, and there's nobody there. And I say, I think the President will be here in a few minutes. Why don't you take a look at the Oval Office? And he goes and looks at the pictures behind the President's desk, the pictures of his family. And he's standing there looking at the pictures, and one picture is laying on its side. And he picks it up, and a recording goes, get your hand off this picture! And it falls on the floor, and the glass shatters. And out of room 600, the bathroom, comes the President saying, I got you!
So Bob, both you and Andy and the whole team at the White House worked just incredibly hard, which is the common denominator of anybody working in the White House, right? You're all in. You give everything you have. And so when you get a chance to take time off, as you guys did, both of you in Isla Mirada, when my dad was out either catching sailfish or
pretending to catch a bonefish.
Bonefish, trying to catch a bonefish or a permit. You guys, you get that extra 3 hours off. And what did you do at the Chica Lodge? Because I think it's an interesting story to show how pathetic your lives are when you're in service of the country.
So this resort has a par 3 9-hole golf course, and Andy and I go out, and I think they only had one club, which was a 5-iron. And I step up to the tee, and I really whack the ball, and it hits the top of a maintenance shed, ricochets from a maintenance shed onto a tree, and onto the green. And Andy looks at me and says, I'll bet you can't do that again. Andy steps up, whacks the ball, and sends it right through the rear window of a Secret Service van. And I told him he had to play it where it laid. But I got to conclude with my own baseball story that included Andy. And this was a rare experience. So opening day, Baltimore Orioles, April 1989. And President decides to go to the game. And the only people in the box with him are Andy and me, President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, and Ted Williams.
Oh my God.
And listening to Ted Williams and George H.W. Bush try to explain the game of baseball to the cricket-loving Hosni Mubarak was right out of Bob Newhart. I don't think I've ever laughed so hard in my entire life. Ted Williams, as you probably know, was incredibly obscene, got quite carried away with frustration with Mubarak, and finally just throws up his hands and, can you believe this? Many expletives, loves cricket. And this day, Andy and I have two rarities. We both each have the only 2 baseballs in the world signed by George H.W. Bush, Hosni Mubarak, and Ted Williams.
If we see it on eBay, which one of you is giving it up?
The
It's
Bush
probably
School,
been stolen.
41 at 100.
Well, guys, thank you so much. These few days are about service and character, and I think the conversation pretty much exemplifies both about you all and about my dad and about all the people that served. So hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeb.
It was fun. Well
Yeah,
done.
that was fun.
Hosni Mubarak.